relatively few changes in the confrontation lines among Syrian, Iranian, and Russian, Turkish, Kurdish, and American forces. And of course, each of those can come in several varieties. We don't know of a more complicated war in the last 2 decades. I can't say the wars are really paused. Lots of people are still getting killed and maimed. But this is a good time to consider realistically what can be achieved in the future, given the strength and disposition of military forces, as well as the political, economic, and social conditions in Syria, the region, and beyond in this, the 11th year of Assad's violent effort to remain in power. This morning, Jim Jeffrey will focus on U.S. policy and prospects. Caroline Rose will look at seldom discussed but important issues along the Syrian border with Iraq, as well as implications of the regime's drug trading. And Andrew Tabor will look at regional and other efforts to adjust to the consequences of events in Syria. This afternoon, let me give you a little bit of a preview. Giovanna Cador will talk about the roles of civil society, especially in the constitutional negotiations. Majid Al-Khatri will focus on the potential and necessity of bottom-up peace building, and Muhammad Al-Abdullah will tell us why justice and accountability are important, even if they are delayed. But first, Ambassador Jim Jeffrey, who comes to us now from the Wilson Center, where he chairs the Middle East program, but still pretty fresh from being responsible for Syria in the Trump administration, and with a long diplomatic and military career in difficult places in the region and beyond. That makes him ideal for analyzing American objectives in Syria, how we are doing and how we are falling short. Jim? You can stay there.
Thank you, Dan. Can I sit here? Or is that
yes,
okay?
please sit there.
Thank you, Dan. And having been involved in you in one of my earlier escapades, Bosnia, it's good to be back working with you here on Syria. I'm going to fail at analyzing at least current American policy towards Syria because, frankly, I don't know exactly what it is, despite having tried very hard for the last 10 months to dig into that. So any of you out there, if you got an idea, please, any question and answer, provide it. Okay, now, what I am going to do is to tell you why the United States urgently needs a Syria policy and what's going to happen if it doesn't have one, or if the one it secretly has and won't tell us about is not going to work, which to the extent I think they really have a secret policy, I don't think it's going to work. To understand Syria, after years of trying to explain it and people looking befuddled, I've decided to use a three-tier approach. At one level, and Dan has taken most of my thunder already, it is the most awful conflict in decades in the Middle East. Anybody who tries to tell you that Yemen is the worst humanitarian crisis, this is the bias of humanitarian delivery agencies. I love these guys, I've worked with them, but they have a particular hang-up on Yemen. Believe me, Syria is awful. 650,000 killed is the latest trustworthy estimate of how many people killed, most civilians. Hundreds of thousands disappeared or still illegally in prison. Half the population, almost all Sunni Arabs. This is demographic, ethnic cleansing with a vengeance. Half the population, either refugees, 6 million, or IDPs fleeing Assad, and they all have fled Assad. A few exceptions of Kurds, I won't get into. And tremendous potential to create problems. That is the basic level of Syria, an issue that we cannot ignore just for that. But there are two higher levels that have to attract American attention. Frankly, in Africa, Congo over the last 20 years is even worse than Syria, although that's the only example after much thinking I could come up with, and we have managed to ignore Congo because it doesn't have these other two levels. So these are the ones I'm going to focus on. First is, while the international community initially, in a half-assed kind of way, got involved in the Syrian conflict by supporting various rebel groups, us, certain Arab states, the Turks, the real international engagement has occurred in phase 2 of the conflict, when Assad and his Russian and Iranian allies began gaining the upper hand. Basically, the way they have conducted this war has created, I've actually added one since I talked to you, Dan, 8 international conflicts or crises that need to be dealt with, or they will potentially get far worse. First, as I mentioned, the refugee crisis and the IDPs, half of them, 3 million, are in Idlib alone, which is subject to potential attacks and can spill over the border and thus become a new refugee crisis for Turkey and Europe. This is an international problem, as we saw in 2015, that destabilized, temporarily at least, much of Europe, our NATO allies. Secondly, the rise of Daesh, or the Islamic State, supported indirectly, or some would say, I leave this to Andrew, deliberately by the Assad regime. And at a certain point, a state with 9 million people, as big as England, budget of hundreds of millions of dollars, threatening the very substance of Syria and Iraq, and an international problem that pulled in the United States on the ground in parts of Syria and an international coalition. The series of security concerns that Turkey has, and boy, I don't have enough fingers on one hand to count them all. Our ally, the SDF, while it's our really good ally against Daesh, also is an offshoot of the PKK. That's a huge threat in the long term to Turkey, as they don't think we're going to be there for all that long, and they don't know what's going to happen to this mini-state that the Kurds have created. They're also very worried about Assad wreaking revenge. They don't want the Iranians on their southern border. And they certainly are nervous about Russia, where they confront to their north, to their northeast, to their southwest, and Libya and such. They're very nervous about Russia. And finally, ISIS, while that's the least of Turkey's concerns, given the others, they've had more attacks by ISIS than any other country other than Iraq and Syria itself. So that's a major concern, and it has led to not just issues we may have this week with another Turkish incursion, but Turkish occupation of much of the north of the country. That is an international problem that has to be solved. Iran's mobilization of resources to threaten Israel, mainly rockets, missiles, and associated strategic systems. And they're trying to turn Syria, under the eyes of their ally Assad, into another Lebanon, has gotten the attention of the Israelis. So there's thus an Israeli military campaign that's quite dramatic in the air, not on the ground, but it's still very significant. That is a major international issue. There is what do we do with the SDF, particularly after we abandoned our partners and allies in Afghanistan? We certainly cannot abandon them to be it Assad, be it the Russians, be it the Turks, whomever. That's a major international issue. There is the question of chemical weapons. We know Assad still has them. He has used them. He's violated all of his agreements from the 2013 post-Red Line arrangements, and that is an international issue. Finally, there is the issue that you will get into, I believe, of international drug trade to finance his war on Assad's part with his Iranian allies. And all of these things, while they're in stasis right now, it's something like a stalemate, they can blow up in a heartbeat. 3 years ago, Israeli aircraft struck Syrian targets. Syrians fired missiles. They missed the Israelis. They hit a Russian aircraft, leading to a Russian-Israeli confrontation. So you had 4 countries, Syria, Iran, Russia, and Iran, all involved in the Syrian conflict, running up against each other. We had a complex attack on a base at Al-Tam, which is an interesting place that has little to do with our official mission of fighting Daesh or working with the Kurds, because it isn't anywhere near either. In the south of the country, just a week or ago, and we don't know what the administration is doing about it. We had a near confrontation that Andrew was with me when we were working with the Russians in the Northeast in the fall of 2020, the famous, colliding with American armored vehicles incident that required a major escalation on our part. This is the things under the surface that can bubble up in a second. So this second level is very dangerous. And no solution to Syria that doesn't scratch the itches that have us, the Turks, the Israelis, the international community, including with the resolution, a major UN effort to resolve the first tier, but has to deal with the second and third. Finally, a word on the third tier. The third tier is the geostrategic. Syria isn't Afghanistan, Sudan, Libya, or Yemen. It's at the very center of the Middle East. It impacts everything that happens in that critical area. And in the last 3 months, everybody who is saying, oh, we're pivoting to Asia. Yeah. Middle East, that's a vale of tears, or as Trump called it, sand and blood. Well, we're now panicking over gas prices. We're now panicking over a resurgence of ISIS, and we're panicking over the Iranians not playing ball on the nuclear portfolio. 3 of the major things that have kept us in the Middle East. The Middle East doesn't go away, and you can't go away from the Middle East. And so the strategic level is very important. What's happening there is not initially planned, but by the way things have worked out. Russia and Iran, with somewhat different philosophies, are trying to undercut the American security system in place in the Middle East since 1973. Now, many of you know the Middle East, particularly people from the Middle East, who say, what security system? It's been a veil of tears since 1973. At certain levels, yes. But all in all, the state system has remained upright. The United States has been the 911. Sometimes it doesn't answer immediately. Iraq 2014, but sooner or later it does. Kuwait 1991, Afghanistan 1979 on, 1980 on, and such. And more or less keeps the place stable. Russia and Iran are undercutting that. That has huge geostrategic impact that goes beyond the region. For all of these reasons, the United States needs to have a policy towards that, and any policy that doesn't address that strategic third level problem and the specifics of those international issues at the second level is not a policy that will work. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Next up is Caroline Rose, a product of American University and the LSE, who is playing a key role on one of the newer stages in town, the New Lines Institute, which has contributed really so much in the last year or two to our understanding of the greater Middle East. Caroline?
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the Middle East Club for having me here today. I know I was speaking with a few folks. This is my first in-person panel since the pandemic, which is so nice. It's great to see some physical faces finally in an audience, and also no Zoom mute button. No Zoom mute button.
At least not for us.
Exactly. Well, actually, I take that back.
Yeah.
So I'd like to start, and thanks so much. We're having this discussion at a very timely and crucial time in Syria policy, but also in the context of the security landscape in the Levant and the greater Middle East. It's a very peculiar time in the Levant. We have 900 or so forces in northeast Syria. Our Special Ops Command Central just replaced Special Ops Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve with a Levant task force. We are considering potential withdrawal in Iraq. We have floated around the idea of withdrawal in northeast Syria as well. Russia has expanded its presence further east. Recently, it just sent its Su-35 fighter jet to Qamishli Air Base. That is a huge difference in Russian activity. And amidst all this, the Assad regime is pursuing rapprochement with Arab allies in the Middle East. And the United States seems to have a policy, but building off of what Ambassador Jeffrey just said, I think that some of the lack of attention and the lack of statements and activism that we've seen, there's a lack of momentum. It makes me concerned whether this is a pause or whether this is paralysis. Are all of these developments paralyzing United States policy and a strategy in Syria? And one element that I have been studying and researching for over 3 years, well, almost 3 years, has been the Syrian illicit economy that has emerged in Syria and Lebanon, with an increasing evidence of state participation in these illicit trades, mainly the amphetamine type substance called Captagon, and a bit, of course, with cannabis cultivation as well. And so the of AIM or its partners, Hezbollah, and Iran-backed militias associated with the IRGC, the Quds Force. And essentially the evidence of lab production on industrial scales has led to Captagon and the illicit economy being not a Syrian problem, not even a Levantine security problem, but a Mediterranean zone security issue that I have not yet seen addressed in US policy. And building off of what Ambassador Jeffrey said, there are all these challenges and these questions that we need to address when approaching Syria. For example, what our mandate is in the Northeast. Will we sustain this force projection of 900 or so American forces? Are we going to try and change this? Are we going to continue our mission against Daesh? Or what is our posture going to be against some of these Iran-backed militias that have increasingly launched strikes on US defensive assets? But on top of that, and I think one of the biggest spaces that I think the United States could be very proactive in addressing Syria is the illicit economy. That is something that certainly we could have an interagency approach to counter how the Assad regime is evading sanctions, and then also how they're producing a substance that, very put simply, is poisoning their citizens. There is limited lab analysis of what is in Captagon, but if anyone wants to trust the Assad regime, which has gassed and killed their own people in constructing and essentially building a substance that will produce a euphoric high, they're crazy to trust such an actor in of course drug production of these types of substances. So this is something that I am incredibly concerned of, and I know that there are a lot of analysts that have looked at Syria and the security landscape and have also remarked how this has impacted clashes, how this has impacted how Syria interacts with its neighbors. And of course, it throws another wrench into how the US is addressing Syria and its security landscape. So thank you.
Thank you. Caroline, let me tempt you to say a word also about this question of the closure of bases along the Iraq-Syria border.
Absolutely. No, that's a great point. Another thing too, and this kind of goes along with my point about what our mandate, what our mission, what our purpose is in the Northeast. In the last year after the Soleimani fallout, I'm sure that many people are familiar with, in 2020, the United States transferred from, I believe, more than 8 bases within just a matter of a few months. One of those bases being the Al-Qaim base, where there was recorded heavy presence of Iran-backed militias associated with the PMF and Kataib Hezbollah. And this is something that I'm incredibly concerned about, as while we are withdrawing and further reducing our presence in Iraq, is there a strategy in coordinating with our force projection in Syria? There has not been much said about this. And in terms of the intelligence support, the reconnaissance support, the logistical support that our missions in Iraq and our forces in Iraq and our bases there, that they provide our forces in Syria, there certainly is a fear about the increasing isolation that our forces in Syria are experiencing, especially too with the introduction of potential Turkish offenses in the region, increased Russian and regime presence, this definitely throws a wrench and a big question mark as to how the United States is going to be able to sustain this presence safely and keep our troops safe, and of course have a very clear-cut policy in the region. Thanks.
Thank you, Caroline. Let me turn now to Andrew Tabler, who has spent years of quality time living and working throughout the Middle East, but especially in Syria, more time, I think, than any of the other of us, as well as serving in the U.S. government, but he's now returned home to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Andrew?
Great. So first of all, thanks to Dan, Samin, and Sarah for putting this all together today. It's great to be with you in person. I totally agree with Caroline, and it's great to see some familiar faces in the audience. So it's always easier to go last, and this is no exception. I just want to make a couple of comments that maybe will help flesh out a little bit, and Ambassador Jeffrey will swap me if I get out of line or go over any lines. I'm just kidding, he won't do that. So there has been a lot of talk, and Dan mentioned that I would discuss some of the regional approaches to Syria. But I think it's important to house this in Washington as well and to start out that way. So there has been a lot of talk about, you can find it on Twitter and elsewhere, and criticism by some of those who are around the current administration that our Syria policy was a failure, that we did not succeed in achieving any of our objectives, and therefore that the United States should go off in a different direction. A couple of responses to that. First of all, I think that is the reason for that talk. Some of it has to do with a sort of misreading of what our policy really was. Our policy in Syria was to use economic, diplomatic, and other pressures to get the Assad regime into a negotiation over UN Security Council Resolution 2254. That was our goal. It was not regime change. It was never regime change for a number of reasons. One was the president didn't support that. But as much as we would perhaps like that personally, we have reached a certain point where politically it wasn't possible. You would need military assets to carry that out. Minority-dominated clientelistic regimes don't go without a massive military intervention, as we know. That was not in the cards. Instead, we looked at, and Ambassador Jeffrey developed this, and I implemented it at the NSC and then came over to work for him. We developed instead a plan that we felt would use economic and these other pressures and isolation of the regime to get it into this negotiation, because giving way in Syria wasn't working. Collapsing zones in Syria the opposition held and handing them back over to the regime wasn't working. It wasn't getting the Iranians out of southwest Syria, and it wasn't keeping the members of the FSA who were part of these deals from being hauled off to prison. And as I wrote earlier this year, we were in a way duped in Da Nang, the Da Nang agreement with President Putin and President Trump. So we wanted to go in a different direction. Ambassador Jeffrey led us in that different direction. The whole team pointed in that direction. So that policy, so as much as we have those kind of criticisms, I just wanted to sort of squat that down and explain what our policy was. In the region, there have been a couple of different approaches to the Assad regime. Many of those countries supported our policy of isolation of the regime. But over time, two different groups of countries took a different approach, some very realistically and some for other reasons. So there was a cost. So economic pressure is a chronic pressure. It's not an acute pressure, except at very small times. And so you're building it over time to create an end result. And that isolation and pressure was get us into this negotiation. The longer that the regime drug its feet to not get into serious negotiations, they tried to run out the clock on the Trump administration, which they succeeded in doing, thinking that they would get perhaps a better deal from the new team. I'm not sure if that's going to happen, actually, but that's what they were banking on. When that isolation and pressure costs regional countries, particularly Syria's neighbors, dearly. Jordan, first and foremost, and Jordan recently has been at the forefront of this effort to try and reach out to the Assad regime. It is primarily driven by economic measures. I think they're pretty clear-eyed on, and Ambassador Jeffrey recently wrote about this. They're pretty clear-eyed on what the regime is up to, the narcotics. There was just a drone that was shot down the other day in Syria that was loaded with narcotics. This goes on and on and on. So I think they very realistically look at the situation and say, well, okay, perhaps with carrots instead of sticks, we can try and see if we can lead the Assad regime off in a direction, again, towards 2254, right? So that's not actually a big leap from our policy. There are another group of countries, I would say the UAE is maybe among them, or maybe the leader in this, that have a different approach. They are reaching out to the regime for reasons of, yes, I think they want to use carrots instead of sticks, but it is largely an effort to try and undermine their opponents in Syria, particularly Turkey in the north, and their supporters in Qatar, with their still arch rivals. And this is a type of engagement that I call, although I'm not saying all these things are still works in progress, but this is a sort of in the feckless engagement camp, where you do what many countries did in the past. This involved Saudi Arabia, Qatar, others. This is before the revolution, where you simply back up large dump trucks full of cash and dump them over the border into Syria and have the regime scurry off with it. And you end up with a couple of real estate projects and so on out in Badia and elsewhere. None of that led to any kind of reform. So in terms of going forward, I think that the regional countries, as well as I think the United States, supports their efforts to try and use carrots to lead the regime off in a different direction. Ambassador Jeffrey and Caroline have outlined why the strategic reasons why this is necessary. This has nothing to do with my personal feelings about the regime or my personal experience there. The regime that controls Syria is nothing like the one that I lived under, that many Syrians lived under. It has morphed into a North Korea-like on the Mediterranean, okay? You can look at all the different layers of it, right? And Ambassador Jeffrey laid it all out, including 8 of them, but the narcotics, other things. All of these are strategic threats. All of these are files that I had to deal with on the NSC that had nothing to do with the settlement in Syria, right? That are just threats to U.S. national security. It is possible that this economic pressure that we build up could lead to the Assad regime changing its behavior in return for concessions. It's possible. The question, though, is where is this all going? And this is what we don't have from the administration so far. We do not have a clear, you have to have a political strategy. Where is this all going, right? And if you're going to continue to use, I see it in 2 ways. One is, where is it politically going and diplomatically going? And if you're going to continue to use economic pressure, this is my big bugaboo, you have to use that economic pressure tied up to an internal political strategy to push people in certain directions, or the economic pressure that you're building ends up hurting everyday Syrians, which is not the intent of our policy. So no matter what side of the aisle you're on, we all have our work to do. And I think the biggest problem is we are now in November, and I would challenge anyone to actually spell out to us what our Syria policy is. Most of it carries over from the time from the Trump administration, but there have been some gives, right? There have been attempts to wind down the Delta Crescent Energy contract in Northeast Syria. That has been extended 3 times now until the end of the year, I believe, is the latest.
Thanks to Andrew.
That's not my doing, but in any case, it's important pointing it out, right? That this contract, which allowed this company to help Syrians develop their own and use their own energy to stabilize that part of Syria. There's been an attempt to wind down that contract, but again, it's been extended. That attempt, if successful, will hand over Syria's largest oil field to a now Russian-controlled company, if that goes through. Okay, so watch that space. That is a carrot. Okay, and that carrot was put on the table during the negotiations over the cross border, which Ambassador Jeffrey valiantly put forward the entire team. We were all focused on that, and we got a year extension with the economic pressure. With the offering Syria's largest oil field, we got 6-month extension, then a report, and then a 6-month extension, we believe, but the Russians say, wait, we have to wait until the report comes out. And that actually is a live issue right now. Right? So watch that space as well. But most importantly, because we're now almost been a year since the election, lots of people are asking questions about where this is all going. Members of the Senate, members of Congress, and others, and they are legitimate questions. And by the way, they're from both sides. So I would say that, I'll end with this, I believe that sanctions are our best tool to try and affect an outcome in Syria. However, we need to look at sanctions a little differently, in my opinion, as more as switches and knobs on a dashboard, not the hammer. The hammer sometimes you have to bring down, and it is deserved, and there, especially when you're in a crisis. But we need to look at these sanctions differently, so we don't end up hurting people, and so we try to come out with a political result that we want. And what we want is a solution in transition under Security Council Resolution 2254. That's not regime change. That's the only settlement that everybody has signed up to in Syria, and that is a completely reasonable thing to pursue. How it all ends up, how we all get there, is a matter for the diplomats and people in government, along with Syrians, to decide.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm going to try to engage our panel in a little bit of a discussion. In order to do that, I need to pose a couple of provocative questions. The first, I think, derives directly from Jim and Andrew's presentations. Is it really realistic to think about a negotiated path to implementation of 2254, a change in the Constitution? Or frankly, are we past that? Are we at the point where we have to abandon the hope of constitutional change, which was never the main issue for the opposition? The opposition is actually not very concerned with the contents of the current Constitution. And shouldn't we be setting some kind of lower objective for ourselves? And I hasten to add that, 8 issues, I don't dispute that the 8 issues plus the 9th of geopolitics exist. They exist. But I know that the US government can't deal with all of them at the same time, especially in a conflict that's regarded as second or third tier priority for the US government at the moment. So I'll ask one more provocative question. In addition to setting a lower objective than 2254, should we be just thinking, the Russians bought this place. They've been successful. It's better to have them there than the Iranians there. Why don't we let them do it?
Can I start with
Please.
Okay. I'm glad you asked the first. Actually, I'm glad you asked both questions, but particularly the first one, because I was going to make a minor tweak to Andrew's really wonderful presentation, particularly the parts of it where he mentioned me. Thank you, Andrew. And that is, to be sure, our goal, and it wasn't just our goal in the 2018 on Trump, it was also John Kerry's goal. When he was doing his rather frenetic Syria diplomacy in the late Obama administration, largely with Lavrov. Our goal is to, by exerting all of this pressure, and Andrew said other, I'll say military, because the combination of the Turkish military presence, the Israeli operations, our own presence in the north and the south, and the U.S., French, British readiness to strike on response to chemical weapons together. It's an ugly one, but it makes up a military pillar, exactly the one that John Kerry kept pleading for from President Obama and didn't get. And believe me, it wasn't easy to get it in the Trump administration. It took a lot of coordination with those various allies and in our own administration, but it still was a military pillar as well as the economic and the political. To put pressure on the regime, first of all, to freeze its victory, its chances of a victory, because as Andrew said, it was on a roll, as what did you say, the collapsing of position after position and the dupe that get a compromise that would give, particularly the Russians, their minimum needs, and we heard that all the way up to Putin personally in Sochi in 2019, which is a friendly government, military presence, and some acknowledgement that they are made progress, and we're willing to give them that. And for Assad gets to survive if he changes his attitudes and his, more importantly, his behavior. That was the deal, but we weren't sure we could get it. And you're right, we may not. But there was another implicit purpose, and that's why I stressed the third level, the geostrategic. Stopping these guys from winning in a place as important as Syria by such a violation of every norm we have tried to put in place since 1945 is a strategic defeat for us, the West, and the international system. Keeping them from doing that was not only a means to the end of a negotiated settlement, which is the solution we would all want, and Dan and I got involved in with Bosnia, a little shaky these days, but still, it's been 20 years, almost 25. But in and of itself is not just a means but an end, stopping them from doing it. Now, you might say, boy, that's cynical, that's unfair, and that doesn't sound like the Biden administration. That's Joe Biden, who was the lead man, Ukrainian policy since 2014. We all have the Normandy process and the UN resolutions, rather like Syria, and we haven't made much progress towards them. Who controls Crimea? Who controls the Donbass? But what we have managed to do, despite major efforts by Russia, including last spring and possibly now in December, to upend that is a frozen conflict that blocks Russia from having a true geostrategic success in Europe that it would use to expand its aggression, expand its power, because Ukraine is a big, big piece of territory. And that's the lesson from the 1930s, that it's ugly, but keeping the other side from winning is not only a way to try to get the other side to the table, if you can, it's also an end in and of itself, and that was the argument. Now, that gets to the Russians. Again, the Russian scheme for the Middle East, and I'm not totally positive on this, but by both the way they negotiated and their various schemes, such as the CSCE or an OSCE for the Middle East that Vitaly Nomkin, who is a very close advisor to these top guys, has pushed, points to the direction of what Putin wants, to unearth the post-1945 order and replace it with the 19th century. Because Putin is a classic 19th century player. Remember, Barack Obama once said, that Putin sitting over there like the child at the back of the class, he doesn't get it. He thinks he's in the 19th century. We're all in the 21st century. If only Barack was true. These guys are trying to pull us into the 19th century, again, because Putin doesn't see a place for a powerful Russia in an American ordered system. But he knows how to play by 19th century rules. In the Middle East, that means US, Russia, Turkey, Iran, Israel, and probably Saudi Arabia, given its religious, financial, and oil roles, would be the big players. Everybody else is roadkill, and Putin has said as much in reference to some of the countries around his periphery in Europe. You know, they don't get to decide. We decide, the big powers. That's Putin's goal. Iran's different. It's trying to set up a hegemony in much of the Arab world and become the dominant power. Read not what the Ayatollahs say, but what Syed Hussein Mousavian, who's considered a liberal, chased out of the country by Ahmadinejad and found a sinecure in Princeton, I wrote a book on the nuclear negotiations, which he was involved in. And in the introduction, he lays out the Iranian security plan for the region. It's us out, Israel down, and Iran in charge. It's that simple. That's what they believe in. Now, is the Russian model better than the Iranian model? That stands question in one respect. Theoretically, yes, except that Russia is inherently a more dangerous country. This idea that Russia is a declining power and we have to worry only about China, I'm not so sure that's correct. In various areas, from the Havana Syndrome to cyber war to their nuclear arsenal to their aggressiveness, that goes far beyond what the Chinese are doing, largely by sailing ships around, and nothing more than that. Russia remains a serious threat to the international regime. I'm sure we can deal with Iran if we see Iran as a problem. The difficulty with this administration is not they don't have the capability of contesting Iran's march through the region. It's that they don't seem to know that's a priority or a mission. But sooner or later, believe me, one way or another, it'll come home to them, and they have the ability to do it. Stopping Russia ain't easy. We tried it in Syria, we tried it in Ukraine. The best we've been able to do is to freeze the conflicts. I'm not so sure if I had my choice, I wouldn't prefer Iran. Iran just creates chaos. Look at Lebanon, look at Syria, look at Yemen. Russia creates step-by-step expansion. And one of these days, it's going to be, a really serious problem. Germany in 1933 was not very worrisome. Thus, people didn't care very much about the expansion of the 100,000-man army, militarization of the Rhineland, and then they started nibbling medium-sized bites like the Sudetenland. And then one day they were marching into Poland in an alliance with the Soviet Union, and oops, away we went. Thank you.
Let me invite Caroline, you to also comment on this question of what should our objectives be, and how should we allow the Russians to do, at least inside Syria, what they want?
Yeah, so I think that with the recent conversation about Syria, especially with the acceptance that the Assad regime at this point has enough territory to define the end game and to define the end result, which is that the Assad regime will ultimately stay in power. I think that reality has pushed a lot in this space to then forget or deny or wave off Syria's geostrategic importance. And I think that this is incredibly important for us to remember that as we approach Syria, as Andrew, you just mentioned, we still have leverage. We still have quite a bit of leverage in Syria, and it would be silly for us to then just throw our hands in the air and say, all right, game over. Particularly not only in how the Assad regime behaves, which I could go on and on all day about, but also, as you mentioned, Russian, Iranian presence, some of the destabilizing and malign activities that Iranian militias participate within Syria. Of course, Russia's endgame, our own great power competition with Russia within not only Syria, but also the greater scheme of the Middle East. And this isn't just about Russian access to strategic points like Tartus and Latakia. This is very much about, it's a theater. And this is a theater that the United States should not only monitor Russian activity, but also try and disrupt it, try and deny this, try and, of course, engage in this dynamic and try and use the leverage that it has. One thing I would also like to point out is that, a lot of these Iranian militias, they coexist with Russian presence in Syria. So this isn't just a Russia or Iran. This is a Russian-backed regime that will be able to stay in power along with Iranian presence and in some cases infiltration of a lot of the regime's military forces, especially within the 4th Division and some higher command and certain units. And as Ambassador Jeffrey just mentioned, Iran's game plan is to paralyze a political system and security system to try and take over, this security landscape and use that as a launching pad for Mediterranean operations. That should concern the United States, and I think it does. And I think that this certainly plays a key role in this evolving strategy. Something I did also want to mention from your last points, I agree that sanctions are an incredibly important part of our leverage strategy and the tactics and the tools that we want to use against the Assad regime. But I think, especially since 2020, since July 2020, when we started to see the gargantuan size of the illicit economy and the alternative revenue streams that the regime profits from, I think that we are now faced with the fact that there is a widening hole in our sanctions strategy that doesn't deal with the fact that there's a new channel for funds that not only allows the regime to stay afloat, but also it benefits its partners, it strengthens existing partnerships, and it's also starting to bother and aggravate regional partners that are now then trying to engage with the Assad regime to see what kind of security situation and security deal that they can essentially prevent the overspill of illicit substances. So I think that is something that when we talk about what tools we have on the table, how we can re-engage, how we can reconfigure our Syria policy and what tools we can use, we absolutely have to factor in the illicit economy into these discussions. Otherwise, we can't just have this sanctions policy on autopilot. This problem is going to metastasize. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Andrew, I'm going to continue playing devil's advocate and ask you to comment on, is the 2254 objective simply so unrealistic today that it needs to be abandoned? But also, Syria has been part of the Russian sphere of influence for a long time. Latakia and Tartus have been available to the Russians for decades and decades. It never really bothered us, even during the Cold War. It's just hasn't been a big issue. So from the Russian point of view, what we're trying to do is roll them back. And they don't want to be rolled back. Even if they weren't an expansionist power, they would have an argument that why should we give up Syria? And the administration at this point, is clearly looking for ways of reducing commitment in the Middle East. I mean, we can all argue against that. We can all say how important the Middle East is. I actually have argued for many years that we paid too much attention to the Middle East, but I also think withdrawal has its risks and that we didn't take those sufficiently into account. But, our giving up Syria is not giving up anything we owned. It's giving back to the Russians what they have owned for many decades.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So to knock it off in order, so 2254 is actually is an amalgamation when it was developed of two things. One was the Geneva Communique of 2012. And the other one was what was loosely called the Iranian 4-point plan to Syria. And so the fact that that's together in one piece in the Security Council resolution gives you a lot of room to maneuver, I think. So is it viable or completely reasonable to ask the Assad regime to get into negotiations over its constitution? Sure. I mean, how is that unreasonable? How is that regime change? I mean, North Koreans even negotiate over their policies. Granted, it might not be about how they treat dissidents, but they negotiate about their nuclear program. They negotiate about other things with us, directly sometimes. Changes to those would then perhaps lead to changes in the Constitution. Well, they've changed their Constitution in the past too. Why is it so strange that this regime would make changes to its policies? They're very good at co-opting people, by the way, including opposition members who are inside of the country. There is a domestic opposition who stayed there. They differ oftentimes with the opposition, which is outside the country. They could easily co-opt them and bring them into a settlement. And then perhaps the SOC would go along. I mean, who knows? I mean, this is all theoretical. How is that like regime change? 2254 is not regime change. It is a negotiated, agreed upon settlement of the war. Now, how realistic is it? I think is what Dan was saying. Well, when you have a country, when we were in government, Ambassador Jeffrey defined it as the 5 armies, right? And the different military forces he outlined, they're the ones, the people that were taking the shots were calling the shots on the ground, and that still is the case. But a lot of those players are international. Us, the Russians, the Iranians, the Israelis, certainly, and the Turks, right? So there is a way to put that into place. So I think in the end, would we end up with President Assad leaving power? Well, I'm not even sure that is even fully outlined in 2254. It says that the current government and opposition and, quote, other groups negotiate an outcome, right? And it's spelled out. There could be a lot of options. So I think it's still completely viable. And those that say that it is tantamount with regime change probably want the regime to stay anyway. And also maybe just aren't very well drilled into the diplomacy on Syria, which is completely reasonable. It is, as Ambassador Jeffrey said, and Caroline has outlined, it's incredibly confusing, right? So, so there's that. As for the contested space, and particularly the Russians, so I think there are a couple of things. One is the great failure of, and I use the word failure, of not enforcing the red line, chemical weapons red line. The cost of that was not just shaking up our allies all over the world, the Japanese, Koreans, elsewhere, Europeans. That was enough. But it also signaled to the Russians that they would re-enter the Middle East for the first time that they were essentially kicked out in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Either whether it was by Anwar Sadat or because of the massive failure in 1967, or the outcome of 73 and the diplomacy that happened thereafter, the Russians went home largely, and they did maintain this pier up on the Syrian coast, but they re-entered the Middle East in a much bigger way, Dan. I mean, they're back in lots of spaces, not just in. They use Syria as a launching point to go into Libya and elsewhere to do deals, military deals with it. This is not in America's interest, right? Especially when you have American equipment alongside Russian equipment, which is the big issue that we're trying to deal with in Turkey, right? With the S-400s. Big problem. So, so I think, however, there is an idea, and I never was able to figure this out, and I'd be glad to hear Ambassador Jeffrey on this, but is I was never ever sure if the Russians couldn't get the regime to agree to these things, or they just were not as invested in it. I think there were some people who were invested in it from the Russian side, but in the end, the changes have been unbelievably minuscule. And we need a lot more now. We need it faster, or the Syrians are going to suffer. And my last point, in this environment, as someone who pays taxes, it is not a good idea to throw good money after bad in a settlement that is not at least rational in Syria and meets basic minimum security measures and things in our goals. The Russians want us to pay for a settlement on their terms, and that's where the negotiations come down. I think the regime simply just wants everyone to pay them because that's what they do. We don't have an interest in that. We have an interest in using that leverage, Caroline talked about, getting this negotiation itself. And if we don't do that, the alternative is, in playing devil's advocate, there is an alternative theory out there that, the real settlement is we get a deal we get the regime and the SDF to cut a deal and we pull off. That is a very fully fleshed out strategy by senior administration officials to end the Syrian war. Good luck, because there's a whole lot of things that will not settle. And it might manage it for a while, but it will come at the cost of undermining the international effort to settle the war on terms that meet our security concerns and those of our allies.
Let me just jump in there because Andrew did a great job covering why we don't think that's correct. But I want to get a little, because I was the guy leading the negotiations with the Russians, and make a point. But first of all, a sub-point, because we're supposed to be talking about this current administration's policy, and we've gone about 30 minutes without doing much because it's hard to figure out, but Andrew did mention it. There are those in the administration who would like to do exactly what Andrew said. The point is, they do not control the entire Syria portfolio. That's the reason why the Delta Crescent decision, which was their first and happiest decision, is still hung up because people are asking questions about this. And they're also asking questions about the sense of what Andrew said. So there's a debate in the administration. We just don't know the confines of it. What I do know about, and it's a fascinating issue, is what Dan said. Here's my response. First of all, we were explicit on paper with the support of the Turks, the Arabs, the Europeans, and the Israelis, of reassuring Russia that A, we did not want to see its bases withdrawn. We had no problem with any level of Russian military presence in the country, and we understood it needed a friendly government, or otherwise the next government would throw it out, and that probably meant Assad. That's one reason why there was no regime change. It was reached too far. Furthermore, because we were dealing with the Russian military, who had a lieutenant general at all of our talks, who very much wanted a more extreme, basically the fruits of victory, we dangled some sweetness in front of them. First of all, by going through 2254, unlike what we've mainly done in international situations, we give Russia a veto hold on anything that happens in Syria. And that's a benefit for the Russians because we have, frankly, still, when we want to exercise far more power in the Middle East than Russia does. Secondly, we promised that we would work with them, which was a major elevation of their status to defeat ISIS, which A, is something they want to do because they actually do care about putting Syria back together, unlike Assad. And ISIS is one problem. The devastation of the cities is the second. So they do care. It's not a major priority. They oversight it because they know our freaking out about terror. But they do have concerns about ISIS. And they're not capable with or without Assad of dealing with it. We are capable, as we've shown repeatedly, and we were willing to make them our co-partner. That was another sweetener. We had a set of sweeteners. The point is, so we weren't trying to roll back Russia's role in Syria. The problem is Russia blew its role in Syria. For decades, nobody cared about Russia's role in Syria because it wasn't a major destabilizing element in the region. Two examples. Did Russia get in the way of the Assad regime negotiating directly at various levels and through Erdogan in 2010-11 with Israel for a return of the Golan Heights? No, the Russians were actually somewhat supportive. That is, they weren't trying to make Syria a rejectionist state. It was its own rejectionist state. It has had its Iranian pals to help it. But Russia, all in all, was moderately a plus, typically on Syria in the role. Or another, even more germane example. Where were the Russians in 1998 when the Turks put 50,000 troops on the border of Syria and said, what's his name? Abdullah Öcalan leaves the country, or we invade. Did the Russians immediately mobilize the Su-35s? They didn't have them then. No, they sat back on their hands and let the Turks threaten their ally Assad. That is, the Russians were kind of, I hate to use this word, positive stakeholders in a stable Middle East in their Syria policy. But because of the conflict in Syria and the way the Russians managed it, the barrel bombing, and their enabling of Assad to do it his way, you have all of these crises that are impacting the region. The flow of refugees into Europe, the attacks of Daesh, destabilizing Iraq almost completely, and all over Europe. There is really fear of a second southern Lebanon on its other flank to the northeast, and on and on. All of these problems were created by Russia. That wasn't part of the deal that we basically sat back at our highest levels of power, say after 1991 in the Middle East, and said, hey, Russia, it's cool, you can stay there. The deal wasn't you can stay there and then you can scramble the entire Middle East, which is pretty much what Syria has done. And we just won't do anything because that's your lane. That's your area. You own it. So if you want to totally mess up the entire Middle East and frighten countries from Oman to Ankara, that's okay with us. No, that isn't okay with us.
Thank you, Jim. Let me make clear, lest I be misunderstood. I think the Russians are 100% committed to Assad.
Oh, yeah.
I think there's absolutely no doubt about that. Assad is as pernicious a ruler as they come. It's partly because of that I raised the question, because I really don't think we have the leverage at this point to undo Moscow's attachment to Assad. And we have to be realistic about it. It's absolutely odious to think about our giving in, so to speak. But I bet we could get a pretty good price for withdrawal from Syria at this point. I realize, Jim, that you may have tried that effort, but it just no matter how many times the Russians talk smack about Assad, they're with him all the way because they can't conceive of an alternative that's any better from that perspective.
You're absolutely right. The other factor is whenever, for example, when it was clear that all the way up to Putin, they're interested in doing exactly the deal you spelled out. That led to the May 2019 meeting with him in Sochi. Assad made his first trip in 8 years. Where did he go, Andrew?
To Moscow.
No, Tehran.
Oh, sorry, to Tehran.
He went to Tehran. That was when he refused to see Zarif, which was the only good thing about that whole visit that I was amused by. But he did that to show the Russians that he has alternatives. No, the deal we were making to the Russians was all of that you've said and more, certainly not overthrowing Assad. I don't know how many times I have to say this, but I have to say it not only here, but all the time in response to the administration. The deal was, again, stop messing up the Middle East with these things like the chemical weapons, which the Russians signed a deal with us on before we went to the UN and got a resolution and supposedly got Assad. Stop threatening to go into Idlib and creating yet another wave of 3 million more refugees to destabilize Turkey and our Europe. Stop the policies that have led to half the population fleeing their homes and the rise of ISIS. Stop enabling the Iranians under the guise of defending Assad to put these long-range systems aimed at Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and ultimately our troops into Syria. Those are the things we want Russia to do, and Russia could do that, unlike overthrowing Assad, which Russia can't do, or pulling out, which Russia will not do. Frankly, these things Russia can do because, and this is the point, this was not something that was a problem for us. It was a plus for us. Assad has basically won the war. That is, in the sense that he cannot lose the war now. That's clear to everybody. So the Russians have no reason to continue to allow these extreme things that so destabilize the region and so threaten our partners, allies, and even us in a circumstance where their key interests that you've laid out and that we have acknowledged are no longer existentially threatened, whereas our interests are threatened. That's classic. You were doing the same thing in the Balkans, figuring all of this out. And as you know, we were very careful on what we allowed the Russians to do to gain positions. I would say to some degree we might have even rolled them back a little, or at least we tried to.
The problem is, of course, that this is Putin's Russia, not Yeltsin's.
I know, yeah.
So I'm late, but I do want to open the floor to questions and brief comments, I would say, but I realize we have a very knowledgeable audience and we can take a few questions. I don't know if we have the capability of taking questions remotely. Do we? Yes, I think we do. I hope we do. Anyway, we'll check on that. Let me start here and then I'll work my way up.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Fascinating discussion. And Syria, indeed, I think one of the reasons why
you can take your mask off while you ask the question, Ibrahim.
Why Syria is one of those conflicts that could be prolonged, that is important strategically for all the there's no need for any. So it's like strategic chess game where nobody wants to play next. My question about Russia first, let's say hypothetically, the United States moves out of Syria. Is Russia capable of stabilizing Syria, or is Russia planning on using Western funds on stabilizing Syria? And my second fold of the question, what could make the United States leave Syria? Whether something to achieve or because the United States can't bear anymore. Are there any variables that could change north or south that could lead the United States to remove its forces from Syria? And that's it.
Jim, I'm thinking you might like to
Well, Andrew.
answer the second
Andrew
question.
answered the first one already, I think. Russia wants the West to rebuild it, and that's very much the case. Iran doesn't care, and Assad doesn't care. This is a new phenomenon in the Middle East, and we need to get used to it because we bought in, many of us, particularly in academic milieux and in Europe, bought into the idea that if there's a problem in the Middle East, it's all the Arab-Israeli thing and American imperialism. No, the places where we have troops in the region have been peaceful and basically stable for the exception of Iraq up until a decade ago, the last decade. Where is the horror, the huge populations leaving, the mass hundreds of thousands of deaths in places where we are? Yemen, Libya, Syria, Lebanon, and who's there? Russia and or Iran. So but Russia does actually want to rebuild the place. Iran could care less with its policy on Lebanon. What was it? So I've now gotten all fired up on the second part. What was the first part? What was the second part?
The second one about what variable that might change that lead to.
Oh yeah. The problem is, I realize why I missed that question because I don't have an answer to it because we don't really know what the U.S. policies are towards Syria. So we can't make a judgment from the outside of what they would accept to pull the troops out, to turn on the faucets, or at least lift the holds on the World Bank, the Europeans and others turning on the faucets for aid, stop the sanctions completely rather than 90%, which is what we're seeing now. We don't know what that is because they won't tell us. Now that's a problem for you as American citizens because most of the things that we were doing together, Andrew and I and the Trump administration, they're still doing. Most notably, the 900 troops, well, counting on top, 1,200 troops that are in Syria who are under fire as late as a week ago. And the chemical weapons where we have a standing, we think, though the administration's been quiet on that, cocked hammer to go after them if Assad uses it again. And believe me, he will, because he's got it. And various other things that could bring us into this conflict that can fall out of control. We don't know what the administration's bottom line is, what it is trying to get out of this, so we can't really answer the question. But you, as American citizens, need to know because it's not only a very important place, but we have all of these policies that could get us into serious trouble if they're not managed correctly. And we have no idea if they are being managed correctly.
Other comments?
I have a comment on the last question. Really great questions, by the way. I think it's an interesting dynamic now, and I have to say it, but after the Afghanistan withdrawal, I think that this administration would be extremely hesitant. We'll see it play out in Iraq. We're going to see it play out in Syria. No fast moves in terms of withdrawal. There's now a political component with this domestically. The American constituency, the electorate, is going to be very sensitive with any discussion of withdrawal. Afghanistan was too recently, and I think that this administration won't really make any fast moves. That being said, two scenarios that I don't think are probable anytime soon, but are possible. If these strikes, both drone and rocket strikes from Iran-backed militias, continue to target U.S. defensive assets, and if there is a strike that the United States has to both comment on and respond to, that's something. If these attacks continue to ramp up, that could possibly induce a U.S. reduction in force projection. I don't think a complete withdrawal. And then the other scenario, and as you mentioned, and this was fairly recently. I think it was last year, when the U.S. forces, they were conducting patrols, and Russian forces essentially harassed U.S. convoys along this highway. And I'm not sure if any of you guys have seen this video, but it's a horrifying video. And in terms of command structure and whatnot, you could see how fragmented this was. There couldn't be a coordinated response to this. It was quite terrifying to watch. If there were to be a scenario of clashes, even limited clashes between U.S. and Russian forces, I think, yes, that would propel Washington into a more serious discussion of what are we doing in the Northeast? Do we have to increase our presence there, or is it necessary for us to really consider a measured reduction in personnel? I really hope we don't have to get there, because I remember watching that video, and I'm sure both of you, having been on the other side of that, having to, of course, enact policy in response towards that. That was really, really concerning to watch. And I think it is definitely a reminder that we do have a small presence in the Northeast, but there are consequences and there are risks. So, yeah.
The policy response to that was we pressed DOD to bring back the Bradley armored fighting vehicles that nobody would mess with. And ever since they showed up on the scene and went trundling around, clang, 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 the Russians have been noticeably quiet. Now, we're not here to talk about the foibles and follies of dealing with the U.S. military on geopolitical issues, but that wasn't the first time the Bradleys were there. We brought them in right after the Russians came in October 2019, and then after 3 months, CENTCOM told us, hey, we're pulling them back. They're hard to maintain. So we were left with these little wheeled things that the Russians were pushing off the road and such. And fortunately, we now have the Bradleys, and there are only a handful of them. I can't say how many, but they always make the
confronting a Bradley as it returned from patrol and saying, wow. Imagine.
Thanks very much for the interesting discussion. My question now is from U.S. foreign policy perspective. I'll leave the Syrian part of me for the later panel. So from the discussion, U.S. is behaving from achieving huge strategic interests with regional stability. Negotiated settlement is kind of the operational mode. Economic sanctions is the tool to achieve that primary endpoint. The question is whether these economic sanctions are undermining the first primary endpoint, was regional stability, with pushing actors to behave in an illicit, destabilizing mode. So let alone the Syrian consequences, the sanctions themselves, economic pressure, are destabilizing. And the question would be like tighter sanctions. But are there inherent limitations in sanctions that they fail in controlling these illicit things? There's a big hole that's structural, not as a deficit in the current sanction mode. I think it's more like a dilemma than actually, but the cost-benefit analysis, where do you see it?
It's a very good question. Andrew, I think of you.
Okay. Do you want to talk? And then I can talk.
I'll talk briefly.
Yeah.
So what we need, and we all need, and we needed that too under the Trump administration, is we needed smarter instruments, not more. I think I'm not a big believer in more is more. There are those out there that think it's great, and it sounds great, and you can have a press conference and tweet it all out, and it's fantastic, it feels great. However, unless you marry up that to a political strategy inside the country that makes sense and you have buy-in from the system on it, sanctions, without putting too fine of a point on it, are developed from packages. And when you see it outside, these are all things that have been declassified or unclassified or made unclassified by executive decision to back up the finding. All of these behaviors that the sanctions are tied to are ones that preceded the sanctions. We didn't start sanctioning the Assad regime for butchering their own people first, and then they started butchering their own people. Okay, it's the other way around. Same with chemical weapons, right? Same with, and this goes back in history, right? First they supported terrorist groups in the Middle East, then we sanctioned them for it, right? Messing around in Lebanon. First they stayed in Lebanon and played a role there, which was damaging, then we sanctioned them. I think that we do need to develop smarter sanctions. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Caroline knows more about this than I'll ever know. See, this is just it. One powerful argument is that are these measures push people essentially underground into more illicit activities to survive because they can't make it in the big time because we're somehow constraining them. Well, I mean, first of all, they're going to do it anyway. They already do it. The Assad regime, in my opinion, I've been doing this for 20 years. It's like the mafia created a Stasi. Okay, that's exactly how it operates. They've been involved in illicit activities for a long time. The kind of illicit activities, and I'll hand it over to Caroline, then that's where it gets interesting. I think it's inevitable. We need smarter sanctions, not necessarily more or less. And I think if we do that and we use other measures, which I think Caroline will talk about, I think we can go in a more positive direction. But over to you.
Yeah, so I would like to also just preface this with, I've been studying this for 3 years, but the Syrian situation in terms of its illicit economy, we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's out there, open source information and intelligence. There's a lot that I don't even know, and I have not been able to understand. And really, there are a lot of different sources and a lot of different ways that a lot of these patronage networks, these warlords, and of course the regime, these strategies that they use to dodge sanctions. Now, I'll talk about it from how a lot of these warlords and a lot of these businessmen do dodge sanctions in the first place. We have the existing Caesar sanctions in place, which has been effective in certainly trying to curtail some of the money and funding that the Assad regime's existing elite network and close circle that they've been able to profit from. But there are a lot of existing facilities and businesses now that they have turned to that have not been sanctioned or have not necessarily even received a lot of US or outside attention that have now been used for illicit purposes. So for example, I'll throw out a very well-known example, Rami Makhlouf. He helped facilitate a smuggled shipment to Egypt using one of his companies called Milkman. And you can't make this up. And that was used for a variety of hashish shipments. There has been evidence of Assad family affiliates using companies that were pre-existing workers for Capgon to be smuggled in. You're starting to see everything with Captagon, really. You're seeing it inside of pomegranates. You're seeing it in orange crates, inside of pizza ovens and tumble dryers and washing machines. It is all over the place, as north as Vienna, and then all the way down into Africa, and then of course the Gulf, where there's the destination market for this. How we can acknowledge this, I agree. You can't play a game of catch and be able to do that. These smugglers are smart. They adapt to constraints. But you don't necessarily have to just target this with sanctions. You also need to have a regional policy in place. And an example I'll use is something that happened just recently. Saudi Arabia and a variety of Gulf countries just recently imposed a blanket import ban on Lebanese products. Likely, this was an escalation to an existing ban.
Everything online. Thanks for making the link available. My question to Ambassador Jeffrey about the Kurdish negotiation that you were leading actually, and which kind of collapsed on the Biden administration horizon. Turkey is gearing up for an attack on Tel Aviv. The Kurds are arresting the Syrian National Kurdish Council members when they step into northeast Syria. Where we are on the Kurdish reconciliation.
One more.
Yeah, thank you, Damascus. I mean, when it's adversaries from Greece to the UAE have already opened their embassies in there. The intel chiefs have met in Moscow. Is there a personal feud between Erdogan and Assad, or is there a larger geopolitical reason behind it? Thank you.
Okay, we have 3 good questions.
So on Delta Crescent, So Delta Crescent was brought in to help develop Syrian energy resources for the use of those that are in northeast Syria, and we're on top of those energy resources. And so there it would be developing the oil fields, some of which had been damaged under ISIS, and some of which involved mobile refining too, because as you know, ISIS used, and I think the SDS still uses what are called stills. Stills are crude oil processing facilities that are they're extremely environmentally destructive. A friend of mine has showed me photos that you can see them from outer space in Syria. They look like giant black holes. So the idea was that that company would help develop those resources all over eastern Syria. Now, in terms of how the company was selected and so on, I don't know. That was not my job. But it was an interesting overlay. The involvement of foreign energy companies in Syria goes back to the 1960s. So it was a pretty well staked out area. The exploration blocks under the Assad regime, which predated it, are all exploited by developed by foreign companies, particularly that in northeast Syria in the corner, which is Block 26. That's where Gulf Sands Petroleum is located. That used to be a British, well, it is a British company, but used to be controlled by different parties. It is, as of March, now a Russian-controlled company. They are in an agreement with the Syrian Petroleum Corporation and Sinochem, the Chinese producer, in Syria. That operation was suspended in 2011 by a force majeure declaration to get out of the contract. Each contract is different. Since it has come under the control of a Russian entity, Gulf Sands now publicly says on multiple occasions that they are planning to re-enter Syria and to ramp up their production. There is no involvement, as I can tell, about mobile refining, which actually would be very useful for those in northeast Syria.
I suppose I'm more curious about how these Americans were able to gain access to operate within Syria. If you know anything about the connections with Syrian Kurds or with Iraqi Kurds.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I'll
but
take
maybe
that.
Jim does. Yeah.
They came up on their own. These were people who had connections with, frankly, JSOC, and were on the ground. This was an idea between them and the Kurds. They came to us. I was skeptical in my initial meeting because I'd done a lot of this in Iraq, and you can get crosswise with constitutional and other issues, but this is not an equity contract. It's simply what we call a technical services, which is okay with all the constitutions in the Middle East. And these are the local authorities, the Kurds, and we didn't recognize Assad. They wanted it. These guys wanted it. We had granted many OFAC licenses for operations in northeast Syria, for example, demining. So the question was, would we block these guys? Now, we also thought that this would be good because it would get more money into the hands of the Kurds. This was right after President Trump, unfortunately, blocked all stabilization funding for the Northeast. So we had to go hand in hand, hat in hand, to the Emiratis, the Saudis, and others. We got some money, but it was running out. So we thought all of that made sense. What this administration thinks, I don't know. Likewise, the Kurd talks. We supported them, and because they fit into an overall strategy for Syria that everybody understood, folks who could have scrambled them from Ankara to Masoud Barzani in Erbil went along, or in the case of the Turks, grumbled, but didn't do anything against it, and they continued. This administration, again, vaguely says they're in favor of it, but we don't see any juice in it. Without juice, it doesn't go anymore. The problem with Turkey and Assad is the Turks see a set of existential threats. First of all, and And so it's no longer a happy time. But the basic problem is that Turkey sees all of these existential threats to itself and doesn't want to yield, because if it opens an embassy, how does it justify its troops in northeast Syria? The Israelis have troops not on the ground, but all over the air. We have troops, but neither we nor the Israelis have an embassy. And two rules I'll leave you with in the Middle East. First of all, this one I came up with recently, but it had some echo. None of your best friends and allies, when you look at the bad things they do, are ever more than 85% your friends and allies. 15%, they'll do deals with the other side, be that ISIS, the Iranians, Ankara, it doesn't matter. The second rule is countries are not going to make significant changes in their policies that they're used to, that people have bought into, unless they see some advantage doing that, or disaster looming, which they usually miss. So therefore, that's usually not a reason. If they continue on with the policy, the Turks, this is the least bad option for the Turks, and it will continue again until there is some kind of settlement that they have a say in, and they'll sell their control of Syrian territory dearly.
This has been a great hour and a half. I want to thank the panel and hope you'll join me in doing so. We reconvene at 1 o'clock for a discussion of paths forward for